Okay, terrific. All right, so by way of getting started, let's proceed here with a conversation together. What I'd like for you all to do is to take about 2 minutes and to kind of do a little bit of self-reflection here. We'll be spending the majority of our hour together thinking about effective strategies to crafting resumes, particularly when it comes to our skills. But let's actually start with a few maybe don'ts here to precede our do's. So take about 2 minutes and jot this down to yourself. I'd like to ask that you don't share this with all of us just yet, but write down what you might feel are the qualities and characteristics of ineffective resumes. Okay, so what doesn't work? One of, I think, the takeaways of today's session is that there's not necessarily one right way to craft your resume and its different components, but there are certain conventions that we might keep in mind. So with that, I'll go ahead and take a pause. And again, please take about 2 minutes, jot down just to yourself in your own notes, or kind of think to yourself, what doesn't work? And then we'll reconvene, and I'd like to ask that all at once, you drop your notes into the chat. But for now, just do a little bit of thinking and writing here. All right, so hopefully that was enough time for you to do just a little bit of thinking and jotting around this question. What I'd like to do on the count of 3 is to encourage all of you to go ahead and drop your notes into the chat section here today, if you can do that. All right, so on the count of 3, 3, 2, 1, what are some of the qualities and characteristics of ineffective resumes? Let's see what people have shared with us here. Okay, so we've got some great points here already. Skills not relevant to the job, absolutely essential. Too technical, right? We want to be thinking about our audience. Buzzwords, right? As distinguished from keywords, which I'll talk a little bit about in a moment. Not in bullet format, great. Okay, what else do we have? Using non-active language, love that. We'll be talking about that later, right? Not having a clear identity to the position you're applying to, right? This is something that will be very relevant to hiring managers. Taking too long to read through, right? Including irrelevant, outdated information. So much of effective resume writing is relevant to the process of resume curation, right? What do we include? What do we exclude? And what's our criteria for doing that? Excellent. The font is too small or too big, right? Not in PDF form versus Word document. Lots of great points here. unorganized, it's hard to read, it's not in chronological order. I think ordering is an important part of this, right? How do we order our pieces? It's unfocused, it's poorly structured, it's too dense. So there is a lot of, I'm noticing kind of commentary here around the extent to which we are, speaking the language of specialization in a resume or not, right? Great points here. Too broad, claiming too much, right? So it is possible to kind of overstate your expertise, or talk about instances where we might do that. Looks like it's bragging, right? And the layout is unorganized, irrelevant, right? And then there's some other comments here, hard to read formatting, that's so important, unfocused, generic, right? All of this, okay, great. So lots of, I think, really helpful, valuable points that we are all kind of adding right at the outset here. And so much of our time together today is going to be reflecting on some of these resume fundamentals that are so important to keep in mind, yet I think easily sometimes forgotten or overlooked when we find ourselves in the throes of recrafting our resumes as we're looking for roles. So a couple of more points around this, right? In terms of what wasn't working about the different kinds of, resumes that you all were sort of referencing, right? When you're talking about the qualities and characteristics of ineffective resumes, right? What's maybe not working here? So one point I think that's important to mention that I actually hadn't seen kind of flow through the chat, but it's something I see often when I'm looking at different kinds of resumes, is that it's helpful to think about these documents as logical classification systems, right? Which is to say that for each component of a resume, it's so essential that we pair like with like. And it seems like this might be a very basic strategy to start off with today, but I find that this is commonly overlooked, which is to say that when we're putting together the different kinds of components of our resumes, right? And what are these? Things like our education section, our experience section, research, teaching, awards, fellowships, all of these kinds of things. It's not uncommon for me to find within the weeds and the nuances that sometimes students and candidates for roles will put together one kind of achievement or activity or outcome in a section that might not be fundamentally about that activity, right? So for example, I'll see oftentimes in education sections, people will discuss their credentials, the institution they got those credentials from, the dates, the GPA, all of those kind of relevant materials. And then they'll add a few other bits of information that could be relevant, but that sometimes read as non sequiturs. So it'll be like particular awards they might have won that are important, but they won't necessarily say what that award was for. And it can be distracting when you might just go ahead and put an achievement like that in a separate awards section. So this is to say that one kind of fundamental principle to keep in mind is the all importance of good, clear, crisp organization that flows in a logical and intuitive way. And the reason for this is because we want, and this pertains to the second point here on this slide, our resumes to be accessible, right? So many of you were saying that it's problematic when resumes are too dense, they're too long, they're too jargon heavy, right? Well, what's going on in that moment? Fundamentally, it seems to me that it's a lack of accessibility. I think one of the things that's really helpful to keep in mind is the context of the hiring managers and members of search committees who'll be looking at our job documents. And this goes for both our resumes, cover letters, and other parts of our portfolio. It's not uncommon for those individuals to not spend more than anywhere from 6 seconds to a few minutes reviewing every resume they encounter. And I can say this from my own experience, especially when I'm looking at candidates cold, who I don't have a previous relationship with, haven't met. I will very quickly scan their resume to see how well organized is it, and do they have an explanation of their experience that I can immediately sync up with the needs of the role and the gaps that our team is trying to fill. And this process is done very, very quickly. So much of the trick here is really about cosmetics and aesthetics in a way. How can you guide the view of the reader to the places in your resume that you want them to see in order to engage you for a phone screening first round interview? And then finally, of course, and this is a point that some of you had named in the chat, it is, and I think if you take anything away from this workshop today, it's to keep in mind that resumes are living documents, which is to say that well-crafted ones are tailored to the skills, qualifications, and articulation of duties that are available in position descriptions, right? When we're in the throes of applying for roles, it can be sometimes, I think, tempting to not tweak and tailor so much because we want to just go ahead and send those documents out. But when we do that, or when we fail to pair a resume with something like a cover letter, what we're actually doing is missing an opportunity to convey to the search committee why it is that we are the ideal candidate who can add a particular kind of value to their organization and who can meet their immediate business or organizational needs, right? So this is all to say that taking that time to tailor is probably the most important effective thing that you can do in this process. Okay, so now kind of getting into the meat and potatoes of our time here, right? I know that many of us come at this process with scholarly academic backgrounds as you make your way through graduate school. And so how do we go about translating our skills, talking about our skills in a way that's, appropriate for our resume, right? That advocates for ourselves and that doesn't in any way undermine the work that we've done, while also tailoring it to the roles at hand. So I have a couple of more principles that I want to convey to you all around this as we think about best practices to doing this. So the first thing I want to note here, and I'll show you an example later on that speaks to this point, is that in many instances, and this is very much dependent on the roles that you apply to, the different kinds of fields that you might be interested in, you might find that the boundaries between CVs and resumes can be more porous than you had originally imagined. And so here I actually want to take a little bit of a pause and engage you in a bit of dialogue. So when you think about CVs, and I imagine many of you do have some version of a curriculum vitae that you are working with and maybe riffing off of in order to create your resume, revise your resume. So tell me, when you think about CVs, right, what are some of the fundamental components of a CV, right? So I will actually go ahead and take a pause. I want to engage you here. If you can drop it into the chat or just kind of vocalize it. What makes a CV and what distinguishes it from a resume? And I'll go ahead and monitor the chat here for a couple of your responses. Publications, right? Yeah, absolutely. Research experience, teaching experience, publications, professional organization memberships, and service, right? Thank you for that, Emily, right? So a sense of what are the kinds of achievements that are prioritized in an academic environment, right? And it makes good sense that our CVs would include these things, right? A CV is everything, right? And I think that speaks to truly the way that it can encapsulate the full breadth of your portfolio. We're not typically dealing with things like page constraints. It's less specific. Interesting. I wonder, Michael, what you mean by that. I think I have a sense, and you're onto something important here, right? But interesting point. A CV has everything I've done, and a resume is pared down and specific to a role. Right, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so this is all really helpful, thank you. And I want to just linger for one more moment on this idea that a CV might be actually maybe less specific than a resume. One of the things that I think of in connection with that point is a sense that, when it comes to the language of CVs, they tend to be achievement driven, right? So it very much prioritizes the outcomes of your work. The publications are listed, courses taught, awards and fellowships, all of those things are there. But what is typically obscured in the context of this document are the activities and the skills, right, the day-to-day actions that drove those outcomes, right? And in terms of page length, the longer your CV is in an academic context, that in and of itself will speak to your status in the academy, right? Because it talks to how many different achievements that you achieved. And that is something that will typically be looked upon favorably by a faculty search committee, right? So those are certainly some distinguishing markers between a resume and a CV. But I do want to note that there are contextual situations in which your CVs and your resumes don't necessarily have to be that different. So some of the tools and strategies that you take from this workshop today, I would actually recommend that you integrate into your CVs in the same way you would for a resume. Okay? Which is to say that if you're applying for roles in something like a think tank, a nonprofit, academic adjacent fields, even certain kinds of leadership positions, director level, associate director, things like that, it is field specific, and that's something I'd be happy to talk more about with you. But there are occasions in which it's acceptable for you to submit something like a CV resume hybrid. So my own resume, for example, is a 4-page document that is a merger of professional experience, courses I've taught, fellowships, awards, things like that, things that are prioritized in the academy, and other kinds of duties and responsibilities and skills that are acceptable and certainly looked upon favorably outside of the academy as well. So again, I just wanted to maybe dismantle some of that sense that these two documents have to be so different, when in some ways they're really not. And I'll show you an example of this later on. Okay, very briefly getting on to a second principle here. It is just kind of worth noting that there are certain contexts in which, there are distinguishing factors between a resume and a CV, including things like page constraints and emphasis on skills and highly curated content. And again, this is field specific, and we'll get into that more a little bit later. And then finally, in terms of just, maybe today's fundamental takeaway, effective resumes are so much about guiding the eye, right, to the most essential components of this document where you want the hiring manager's eyes to go. And it includes things like, headers, bolded keywords, good, consistent, logical, intuitive organization, and crisp results-driven descriptions of your activities that showcase your skills. So let's get into this in a little bit more detail here. All right. So I want us to spend some time thinking critically just about the way that we describe and frame our work in terms of skills, right? In terms of thinking, again, if our CVs are prioritizing results and not so much skills, how can we, as scholars, get into a deeper understanding of our skills and represent them accordingly? One kind of element I want to note is that as you grow as a professional, and this is relevant whether you become a faculty member or whether you become a professional in any number of spaces, is that the value you will add to organizations as your career grows is typically based on your skill sets. Right, so hiring managers will want to know that you can do certain things for their company, their organization, and they oftentimes are less interested in things like titles, in things like traditional markers of maybe status or prestige in the university. While those things do hold water and have importance, ultimately it's your skills and what you can do that is most relevant in professional environments, and I think even in academia as well. So how do we articulate our skills? One important way and helpful way to do this is to do so using something called the PAR method, right? Very simply, to break down the way that we describe our actions in terms of problems, actions, and results. And I'll show you an example of this momentarily. Here, I'm referencing two sections of one's resume, the professional summary section, which typically lives right at the top of your resume, and the way that you describe your experience, right? Ideally using bullets, as someone had mentioned earlier. And what you want to do is to think about all of the work that you've done over the course of the last several years, right? The way that you've approached your research, your data analysis, or in the archives, all of the different tools, strategies, techniques that you've engaged as a classroom teacher, right? The ways that you've worked with other students in your programs. And to think about these things in terms of what is the fundamental problem that I solved, right? So the problem might be the problem of teaching. I have been given a class of 35 students. and I am now tasked with accomplishing discrete learning goals for them. So what are then the actions that you took in as detailed ways as you can sort of think to yourself in order to solve that problem, right? And so here is when we get into all the plumbing and the business of, say, something like teaching. And so what does this involve? Curriculum design, right? Working with, the syllabus. It involves working with faculty members. If you were a teaching assistant, right? What is the faculty member prioritizing? How do you go about putting together a discussion section that is memorable and accessible to students, right? So facilitating discussions. Maybe you have prioritized inclusive pedagogical strategies in your teaching. How have you done this, right? So you want to get into the weeds about some of the most fundamental strategies that you have engaged. And then finally, it helps to conclude this process by pointing to results and to quantify those results as much as you can, right? So maybe you've accomplished all of these learning goals throughout the course of your entire portfolio right now, a total number of something like 200 students, right? Or maybe it was lower, maybe it was higher, right? But the more that you can quantify the things that you have done, the more that you will show hiring managers that you are an outcomes and results driven person, that because you're outcomes and results oriented, that you can manage projects and time in a way to achieve those things. And by quantifying your results, you also give folks a sense of the scale at which you operated, right? So you taught 200 students, right? You might have managed a budget that's $15,000, $50,000, $5,000, right? But you give a sense of your ability to work within certain parameters, right? So having that there and being intentional about that can take your resume to the next level. The other thing I also want to add very briefly, and this is something that someone had said in the chat right at the beginning, which is a great way to start this off, is that when we think about something as simple here as the PAR method, right? It is really all about, at the end of the day, the simplicity that's involved in this and reclaiming the art of clarity and simplicity when we're putting together our resumes. So just to kind of give you a little bit of a metaphor for how I think about this process when putting together my own resume. One of the things that I do alongside of my role here at Futures is to teach history to undergrads. I don't know if there's any historians in the room. If not, that's fine. Happy to be here with everyone, of course. But I will often start the semester by asking my students a question. And I will say, please take a moment and define for me the discipline of history. What is history? And the students be very thoughtful and reflective, and they'll kind of come up with a long, complex, metaphysical definition of the past and why it's important. And I will then tell them that's all very good, but at the end of the day, we might define the past by using a very simple construction. People do things. And this points to a writing technique that we can keep in mind when we're putting together our resumes. Subject, verb, object. And so place yourself within the space of this construction, right? You're the subject. You have done something, right? You have completed a task, right? And garnered a result. And so much of this writing process is as simple as that, right? I'm the agent. This is what I did. By talking about your activities, you're leveraging your skills. We'll look into that, momentarily, right? And then getting to the result of the action. And that's really what this is about at the end of the day here. So with that, let's get into this in just a little bit more depth here. One of the things that I've done in my own work is, to think about how I might, translate my own academic expertise into, results, right, for folks who might be looking at, my resume. And this is, I think, an approach as we think a little bit more deeply about the PAR method that you can all take with you. And I should also note, if it's helpful to anyone here, that I will be sharing these slides following this discussion. So this is, language that you can kind of take and integrate into your own resume writing process, right? But if you start and kind of take a look at the left part of this slide, right, I first think about myself as a researcher. And again, this is something you can all do as scholars in your respective fields. Okay, so who am I as a researcher? What is my academic identity, right? In my case, a cultural historian of United States history, and then I get into some little bit more specific content around that, right? So what is that knowledge area, that specialization? In what way have I, moved the needle forward of existing knowledge in my field, right? And this is something that you're all doing. So that's the what. And then again, as you're noodling around with your own resume development process, another helpful question here is, okay, so if this is, my knowledge-based competence, how did I now achieve that, right? And again, it brings us back to this exercise of what is it that I do day to day, which I don't know if you all feel this way, but I find that this can be surprisingly lost on us, right? Because we're so in the weeds. So what are some of the skills that, I can speak about in terms of my own experience, right? Things like public communication, right? How many of us are communicating all the time in classrooms, conferences, explaining our work to folks who are non-specialists in so many different kinds of ways? Our advisor, right? Our dissertation committee. So much of it's about project management, right? We are self-motivated, self-managed for the most part. That's a highly valued skill in many high impact fields. We manage up, right? Our advisor, we manage down students, right? Managing across an institution, another complex and valuable skill set, right? Data gathering, interpretation, written communication, receiving feedback, framing feedback, right? This is really, essential kind of skill, right? To be able to both receive and integrate and at the same time give feedback to colleagues, right? How many of us have been in situations where that process of feedback delivery is messy, right? And it's something that maybe affects us adversely or has affected others. So it really is a skill to give feedback, right? And of course, problem solving. How many of us cannot point in the last few months to maybe fairly significant, complex, work-related problems in our scholarship that we have had to solve, right? How to get funding, right? How to get individuals to answer your emails, right? All of this is important kinds of problem solving. Okay, so I won't belabor the point here for too much longer, but just to give you a sense again of all of this in context as we think about the PAR method. So when I bring this together, looking at one example resume bullet point, right, that brings together this research and this skills-oriented piece and the results here, I'll say something like, I have completed a 400 plus page dissertation, so we're quantifying that result over a 3-year period and collaborated with 5 stakeholders in order to do that. Who are these stakeholders? Members of my dissertation committee, right? And there could be other kinds of stakeholders that you've all worked with as well. People who you interview, if you're doing field work, right? How do you work with those kinds of individuals? How do you work with your, PIs and other kinds of collaborators, right? And then of course, also I mentioned here, analyzing diverse data points from multiple sources, right? And there's so many ways that we look at data, anything from the raw numbers, right? And that we're garnering through our experiments in the lab to working with data from the archives, right? Again, across the disciplines. And then of course, I get into the PAR method and other kinds of ways too. Quantifying articles, right? Mentioning the stakeholders who might be engaged in the publications that IRU have generated, right? Whether it's academic audiences, people who are field specialists, right? And also those who are not, right? And that says a lot about our communication skills. And then I also mentioned at the very end, some of those teaching-based skills, right? Active learning techniques, all of the different ways that I've accomplished student learning goals. And this language, of course, can be tailored to the kinds of skills that you are seeing emphasized in particular job descriptions that you're looking at, that sync up with your experience. And so as you're crafting these different bullet points, you can make sure to integrate keywords that sync up with those job descriptions that accurately explain your experience, but do so in a way that will be immediately relevant and accessible to your hiring manager. All right, so let us take a look at this just briefly, a little bit more in context here. So here is an example, first page of what's effectively a resume CV hybrid that uses the PAR method, I think, reasonably well. It's not to say there aren't things about this resume that can't be tweaked. As much as we want our resumes to be meticulous each time that we submit them to a prospective employer, this is a document, again, that can be tweaked as, as often as we need to as we're applying for different kinds of roles. So I want to draw your attention to just a couple of points here. First is the profile section, or what this individual is calling his summary of qualifications. And this is someone who right from the outset, first of all, includes this section, which is sometimes, not embedded in resumes. And this is a great place for you, again, when you're thinking about guiding the eye of your hiring manager, you've got about a minute of this person's attention, right? Where are they looking first? They're looking at the very top of your resume document, right? So what do? You want to think about that PAR method and frame yourself, your identity, in terms of your skills and your results. So what does this person say? He describes himself as a passionate humanist. That initial adjective, passionate, is fine. I don't even know that you need to have that, though. We want to be really thoughtful about the way that we use adjectives and describe ourselves, but that's fine. A humanist and dedicated community builder with experience across various work sectors. Okay, so we have a sense of this person as being cross-functional, worked in a variety of fields. Engaging public speaker who's able to connect with diverse audiences, a strong writer and communicator, right? So immediately framing himself and his identity in terms of these critical skill sets, right? That I can get in a room and engage different kinds of people, right? And use strategies to do that. And then again, emphasizing communication skills, we get a sense of this person being an active, empathic listener, which, as he says here, with experience in client relationship management and customer service. Why is it relevant that he's a good listener? Because this will help him build relationships with important clients and stakeholders, right? So I think this is a decent example of looking at how someone is able to say a lot and reference his skills, many of which were gained in the academy in reasonably constrained amount of space here. And then again, just to note another example of some of this, the PAR method that we talked about in context, right? You're seeing this person repeatedly as he mentions his role as a pro seminar fellow in a program called Connected Academics. And my understanding is this person participated in this activity while in graduate school. And he quantifies a lot of the work that he did, right? So composed a 10-page report that consisted of feedback from, and he names the stakeholders, right? Students, faculty, administrators, etc. Right? He, established connections with 19 fellow doctoral students, right? Managed a community of 60 pro seminar alumni, right? So we're seeing this happening multiple times across here, right? And so again, this is someone who, he does a similar kind of thing with his experience as an instructor. And so thinking very critically about the amount of space that he has and leveraging it as much as possible to amplify those skills and quantify them to scale. Now, with that, I am just seeing a brief comment in the chat, so I want to go ahead and respond to that. For the summary professional profile, is this tailored to the position you're seeking or the resume you're submitting? Or is that a distinction without a difference? Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you so much for that. So, the short answer is that yes, for the summary, that is probably the most crucial area in your resume for you to actually tailor it to the role at hand. And when you think about the business of tailoring, this is something that you can do throughout your resume as you're applying for roles, or you can focus on discrete areas that you might want to tweak a little bit more that you think will be compelling to the hiring manager and search committee. And so as you're thinking about, okay, where do I prioritize my tailoring and tweaking? The summary of qualifications is your key place to do that. That's right where the hiring manager's eyes are first going to land. And that's your opportunity to show that clear alignment between your skills and their business needs. And it's something that you would then, most likely that would be a project that continues through at least all of page 1 of your resume. But yes, so that the short direct answer is for the profile section, that would be the most tailored piece of this. Okay, and another question here, are summaries recommended for every resume and CV? Yeah, great question, so thank you. So again, the short answer here is yes as well. It's been my experience in conversations with students that those who have this summary section will often talk about many instances in which they were called in for interviews. This is something I've just kind of observed multiple places over time. Again, it's not something that's an absolute requirement, and there may be reasons why you don't want to have it there for anybody here, but it is something that is again, when we're thinking about making this a very accessible document that's explaining our stories directly as we can to folks, this is a great space and opportunity for you to do that, right? And to demonstrate your experience, right, through your skills, you might even quantify a few different achievements that you've garnered that you think are super crucial to the role at hand, and go ahead and throw them in your summary section as well. So there's lots of space here where you can make that compelling case for yourself. So hopefully that's helpful, and thank you for those questions. And please, everyone, do keep them coming as we go here. Okay, so now we are going to move into a little bit of an activity based on some of the principles that we've been discussing throughout the session. So here's what I'd like you all to do next. If you happen to have a smartphone on hand, this would be great for this activity. If not, don't worry, I will pull up the screen I'd like you to look at here momentarily. But what I want us all to do is to take a moment and to examine a role that Apple recently published on LinkedIn. So they're calling the title of it is K-12 Leadership Executive. And what I first want you to do is to examine the job description, right? So this is kind of continuing that conversation around tailoring, and add the most important keywords from the description into the chat. So I will kind of prompt you all as to when to do that. So first, just take some time to read, dissect it, and jot things down. And then following that, we'll spend some time actually crafting a bullet of a potential resume profile that both reflects your experience and that tailors it to the role description. With the caveat that I realize there are some folks here today who might not really be interested in a role like this, or you might not feel your experience aligns. That is completely fine, but it's more to get us comfortable with the kind of writing that is helpful in this particular project of crafting our resumes. So with that, please go ahead and engage with this QR code if you haven't already. And what I'm going to do is shift over to LinkedIn to pull up this job description as well for us to take a look at. So again, the first thing I'd like you all to do, please study the job description and jot down keywords that you feel this particular role is prioritizing that would be useful to embed in a resume. And for now, please don't add it to the chat just yet, but shortly. And if anyone, by the way, has any difficulty seeing the job description, please let me know. If you have any questions more broadly, please let me know. And on here, I'm going to just scroll down a little bit in case anyone's relying on the screen to see more information about the role description. Scroll down just a little bit further, and then we'll reconvene as a group shortly here. Okay, so if anyone needs more time, please do let me know. But why don't we go ahead and take a moment to drop some keywords into the chat here. So if we want to do that on the count of 3, 3, 2, 1, what were some of the most essential keywords that we pulled from our engagement with this particular position description? All right, here it comes. Strong team player, yes. Public speaking, presentation skills, so important. Storyteller, right? We see that multiple times. Advise, mentoring, right? Experience with teaching and academia. This role is very explicit in that sense, right? Building relationships, partnerships, awesome. Leadership, education, right? And this is again an executive level position. Leadership is going to be critical. Critical thinking, storytelling, absolutely. Okay, we've got a whole bunch here. Create, imagine, amazing technology, right? Industry leading, collaborate, collaborative team, critical thinking, boundaries, initiative, right? There's so much here. Building community, executing at speed, right? So can you not only implement particular goals and projects, but can you do them in a fast-paced environment, right? Presentation skills, leadership, oral communication, yep, energetic, right, very interesting, right, the kind of person who they feel will align with their culture, and experience with Apple products, absolutely, right, so there's also that sense of, looking for an expert, right, in this particular sense, and let me know if this resonates with you all as well, and when you think about the kind of, executive that they have in mind, this is someone who enters into this particular role at the nexus of education and what's effectively, as I read this, tech sales, right? So you understand the issues and needs and social frameworks and environmental factors that are happening in educational spaces. You understand how tech might be able to offer solutions to those needs in an in-depth kind of way. And you can use and here's another good one in the chat, right? Knowing how to work with a sales team, absolutely, right? You can use these skills jointly together as a good communicator, a good storyteller, right? To make the case to a wide range of stakeholders as to why Apple products might be a good fit to integrate more fully into school environments, right? Education environments, places like that, right? Okay, excellent. So as you're now thinking about these keywords, take maybe like 2.5 minutes or so, 3 minutes. I'll kind of check in with you all to see how much time you need. And imagine yourself as putting together that summary section on a resume, which can be tough to do. I don't know if you feel like this, but sometimes I can feel like I'm bragging, like someone said earlier, so it can feel kind of icky or uncomfortable to write that section. But a well done one isn't so much about, like, I think some of the inflated language that we're we're worried about or the self-referential language, but rather it's empirically data-driven language that shows how we align with the role at hand. So thinking now about all these keywords you've gathered in your own portfolio, write one sentence, one perspective bullet of a summary that may be compelling to a hiring manager for this role. All right, and I'll check in just a couple of minutes here, and let me know if you have any questions as we go. Okay, so we're kind of approaching the sort of latter phase of our time together. So I just want to check in with you all. Do you feel ready to share, or do you need a little bit more time? Could you just kind of drop a bit of a status update for me here in the chat for anyone who wants to share? I'm witnessing silence in the chat, so I'm assuming people are in the throes of thinking and writing. But if anyone wants to go ahead and just give me a little bit of a status update, that would be super helpful. Okay, so we're starting to actually see some of these, these lines come in. Okay, I mean, I'm totally good with reconvening if you all are. So if folks want to go ahead and add their bullet in there, we can do that. And if you need more time, you can continue working while we discuss this as well. Okay, so I am seeing one bullet here in the chat where someone says, passionate and energetic teacher and mentor, focusing on teamwork and use of multimedia and inclusive materials. Okay, thank you so much for that. So I feel like there's a lot of things that are working about this initial bullet, right? Where we have a sense of how do you teach? You teach by using multimedia and inclusive materials, right? So right away, we're getting a sense of this is an educator who thinks critically about, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You do get to some of that energy that's focused on the culture fit with this particular role. Something like passionate, I do realize one of the examples we showed earlier actually said that, but I might kind of gently encourage folks to pivot away from that word just to get into a little bit more of specific ways, right? Like almost like that energy, right? Like how are you as a mentor? How are you as, working with materials to train students? Maybe use a little bit more specific language when it comes to describing yourself here. Okay, so we have another person, a collaborative critical thinker with vast experience in both media communications and the Chinese language, and has supported organizations such as think tanks and federal agencies in their respective missions. Okay, so I really like how this one starts out with like, I'm collaborative, right? I'm a critical thinker, right? And again, as you're putting this together, it's so helpful to kind of go right back into the role, right? And you can see like this is someone who is going to be working as part of a collaborative team, right? So I'm getting the sense, right, that there was like that direct engagement with the role description at hand. And I also like how this person references experience in particular areas, right? So you might even say something like, like a collaborative, critical thinker. You might even use something a little bit more specific than thinker, right? As you're just sort of like framing yourself as a kind of skilled professional, even though you certainly are that, right? I'm just kind of thinking out loud, engaging with you here around your response. But again, drawing from those keywords is so important. The other thing I might recommend for a response like this is to just go ahead and take the different points you've made and maybe break them up into 2 sentences or so. So you've got a couple of different bullets there because you just have a lot of great content. Thank you. Thank you so much to both of you who have contributed. Would anybody else like to share theirs, or are folks feeling maybe not quite ready? I can give us like another 30 seconds or so to see if any others pop in. Otherwise, we'll kind of get back into some of our wrap up here. Okay, highly capable and collaborative multitasker with the ability to apply knowledge, leadership skills, and energy to issues facing educational, organizational, and technical issues. Okay, so like this one again has a lot of things that are working for it here, right? I like how in one sentence, this bullet is able to situate the individual at the nexus of the educational and tech worlds, which is so much what this particular role is about, right? And so we're getting that collaboration, we're getting the multitasking, project management part of this, which is really helpful. So again, lots of good things there. I also like that this one references leadership skills, right? So remember at the end of the day, this is an executive level leadership role. It's literally got leadership in the title, right? So the more that you can integrate words like that drawing from your portfolio, the better. All right, so thank you so much to everyone who contributed, and I'm hoping this is helpful to everyone across the board as you're continuing to work on this piece of your resume and other pieces besides here. All right, so what I'm going to do is just quickly hop back into the presentation as we draw to the conclusion of our time here together today. Okay, so this is just another slide I wanted to kind of briefly share with the group here, which involves so many different, honestly, words that you can think about and potentially draw from when you're putting together your own resumes. And again, this is something that will be shared with you following this session. I think that sometimes what's tricky about writing a resume is thinking about it as any, through the context of the economy of words that we're all navigating, right? And so having some of that language, right? How do we describe research skills for non-ACT folks, right? And so what we have on the right side of the slide helps with some of that, right? Problem solving, critical thinking, analysis, qualitative skills, like collaboration, independent thinking, teamwork, right? But these are all things that we do in order to be effective researchers, right? And these are things that we can amplify and talk about very explicitly in our resumes. And again, this is similarly done for these other types of skills here as well. The other sort of brief, maybe kind of final exercise I'd love for us to, to do together is, to think about 3 different examples of resumes that I actually have added here. And I'm wondering, as kind of our final moment here together, if anybody, has time, if you want to actually just go ahead and take a look at these these different resumes, like the page 1 of resumes, and actually share with us, like, which one of the 3 listed here do you feel is altogether most effectively written and organized, and why? So I will actually give you all a minute to engage with that. I do realize we're at 1 o'clock, so if you have to hop off for today, that's no problem. Thank you for coming. But I'm just going to take 1 more minute to monitor the chat as we do a little bit of wrap up here for anybody who might have time to stay on. So go ahead and just briefly kind of take a look at these, right? Pretend you're the hiring manager. You know, time is short. And is there, you know, one out of the 3 you find is most effective and why? Again, knowing there's no one right way to do these, but there are some conventions here that might be more helpful than others. Okay, so we've got one comment here. Number 1 has the most readable structure, right? So I appreciate that you're thinking about that in terms of readability, scannability. What else do we have? Visually organized wise, I'd say the Steve Jobs one, which I just like, yes, it's not actually Steve Jobs, but, you know, because I like how each section is specified and defined, right? Yeah. I think that's so helpful, right? Thinking about this in terms of organization, consistency, going back to this idea of a resume as a classification system, right? And then we've got another comment here. 1, because the lines help to break up the sections. Yeah, agreed. Education, skills, experience sections are highlighted well. Summary helps provide a good overview of the candidate, right? And I really appreciate you pointing to these specific components of the resume, right? And how you're feeling it's using these techniques effectively. And then another one for number 1, right? Content grouping makes it easier to scan and find relevant information. Yeah, excellent. So, you know, I'm with you all here. I tend to favor number 1 as well. I do think that there are aspects of number 3 that also can be, you know, appealing in terms of the way that this person's able to condense a lot of content into just a few bullet points. You know, with number 2, I think there's actually several aspects of it we might want to pivot away from a little bit. But again, so I just really appreciate your thinking around this and the way that you're taking these different techniques into account. So again, as we do wrap up here today, just remember that your resume is such a critical opportunity for you to, you know, to showcase your skills, your experiences, to tell that professional story, to demonstrate the value you add to a hiring company or organization. And just as we used that metaphor before around history is people doing things, who's the agent of the action here, right? So much of it is about shoring up yourself, all of the good quality hard work that you've done up to this point in your career, and how you are now ready to position that work in a way that is highly readable, digestible, accessible, compelling, and memorable to a prospective hiring manager or search committee, right? And again, resumes are rarely read in a vacuum. They should almost always be accompanied by a cover letter and or other requested materials, depending on where you're applying to. So with that, we'll go ahead and wrap. Thank you all again so much for taking time out of your day to join us. I would love to continue the conversation. I have added the Twitter handle for Futures, my Twitter handle here. And I'm also happy to say if you want to contact me, my email address is ckelly, KELLY67 @JHU. So with that, thanks again, everyone, and hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you so much. Okay, thank you, everybody. Take good care. Enjoy your day.